Okay, I want to thank, I'm not the regular preacher if we have any visitors today and may not know that, but Brad is our regular preacher and he gave me the opportunity to speak this morning. If y'all didn't have a chance to attend the Faith in Film last Thursday, it was really neat. It was, I highly recommend, the discussion was on Why Beauty Matters by Robert Scruton, and that is available at least through us, even though it's hard to find online, which is kind of the point, or some of the point of the meeting. But I'm sure we'll put something out on YouTube or social media, and once that goes out, I highly recommend watching it. It was really good. So I'd like to kick off this lesson this morning by reading a list of names. And I'm sure y'all will recognize pretty quickly what they have in common. Francis Bacon, Galileo, Johannes Kepler, Blaise Pascal. I had to look up how to pronounce some of these. Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton, Carl Linnaeus, Michael Faraday, Gregor Mendel, Werner Heisenberg. Now, probably most every person here could know what they have in common. They were all scientists. What you may not know is that they all profess to be Christian, which is kind of weird because I've been hearing a lot about how Christians reject science. Something's amiss. Let's make sure we're dealing with actual scientists here. Francis Bacon developed the scientific method. That certainly seems like a scientist. Galileo, more or less, approved Copernican heliocentrism, which is that the Earth revolves around the sun. Blaise Pascal, a math and physics genius, was one of the people credited with inventing the mechanical calculator. Robert Boyle is considered the father of modern chemistry. Sir Isaac Newton is widely recognized as one of the greatest and most influential scientists of all time. Carl Linnaeus is considered the father of modern taxonomy. Michael Faraday was a giant in the field of magnetism, electricity, chemistry, and how they all work together. Gregor Mendel is considered the father of modern genetics. Werner Heisenberg is considered one of the fathers, there were a few, of quantum physics or mechanics. So they certainly seem like scientists. But why do so many publications read along these lines? Christian nationalist rejection of science is exactly what we don't need now. Or, oddly enough from the Baptist News Global, Oregon is burning while most white Christians deny climate science. And here's a very recent Yahoo article. I received it in my inbox. I guess that kind of dates me that I still have a Yahoo email. How white evangelicals' vaccine refusal could prolong the pandemic. And here's one of my favorite parts of that passage. Quote, "The deeply held spiritual convictions or counterfactual arguments may vary, but across white evangelical America, reasons not to get vaccinated have spread as quickly as the virus that public health officials are hoping to overcome through herd immunity. The opposition is rooted in a mix of religious faith and a long-standing weariness of mainstream science, and it is fueled by broader cultural distrust of institutions and gravitations to online conspiracy theories." It's kind of funny. You can always tell if an article is recent if race is mentioned. So yeah, I think all of these came from at least the past few years. Now, you may have already been aware that Christians reject science, vis-a-vis the Big Bang Theory, Darwinian evolution, climate change. But the writers of this article want you to know, they want you to be aware that Christians also deny the science behind modern medicine and vaccines. At least the white ones, the Caucasian ones. They are, after all, the most backwards people of all, which is probably why they're all racist. So to summarize this and these articles, white Christians are racist science deniers that will kill vast swaths of the population and the planet due to their backwards beliefs. Now, personally, a lot of my family went into the medical field. 3 brothers, my older brothers, are doctors. I was always more of a, more inclined to science. I mean, I love science. And I could make concessions with this viewpoint put forth, and I could try and stay in the good graces of culture by saying something effective. Yeah, sure, there are a few backwards people out there that have hurt the image of Christians as irrational, but there's no conflict between science and religion. They occupy totally different spaces. Science deals with what's real, the physical world. Religion occupies the moral space. Religion has no place in a chemistry or mathematics class, for instance. Now, probably most of Christianity, including myself, at least a few years ago, would have agreed with those sentiments. Science is for the brain. It is objective. It's where facts belong. Religion is for the heart. It is subjective. It's where values and individual preferences go. But this is known as the sacred-secular divide. And there we go. Now, this is just an example. You could put numerous other things in these categories, but this is more or less how things split up. And this is a lie. And I want to demonstrate not only how devastating this idea is, but how prevalent it is in our society, including probably all of us to some degree. And it's robbed Christians the ability to be salt and light in the world. Amen. It keeps a Christian's personal faith locked in a private sphere of religious truth or personal belief. Instead of the truth, it becomes your truth. And your truth is no more valid than anyone else's. And if you were raised in the West, believe me, this has been going on for a long time. So nobody here is alive before this started to really take hold in the West. So we've all been afflicted by this false paradigm. And to illustrate this, I'm going to give ask some questions. And I'm going to start with an easy one, probably something that everyone will recognize. Is there a sharp contrast between your thoughts and life on Sunday, the Lord's Day, compared with the rest of the week? And that's just a softball question. I mean, easy. You've heard it before. Let's go a little bit harder. How about this? Would you agree with this statement? The Bible is the place we go to learn about God. Well, that's a trickier one, right? Because what's the implication of that statement? That the truth about God is confined to one particular source. Romans 1:18, when talking about the Gentiles, says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men, who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in things that have been made. So they're without excuse." Now I read here that the attributes of God are so obvious in the natural world that we have to close our eyes not to see them. How about another one? Let's take a fictional character. It's pretty funny because we were debating, we were like, Jim, well, no, there's a Jim. Dave, no, there's a Dave. So we settled on Joe. I don't know. So if I were to say something like, just tell you, Joe has fully devoted his life to God's work. And what do you think of? What would you take that to mean? Well, probably that Joe has left his profession, his regular career, to become a pastor, a preacher, perhaps a missionary. Because that's God's work, right? In the sacred realm. But why don't we think of him as a software developer, let's just say? For that matter, does God even know how to read software? It just doesn't seem to fit. Another one, kind of likened to it. How many of us, when we sometimes get that feeling like maybe we should be doing more for God, and we think about something like, well, I had a volunteer at church, or maybe even I need to share the gospel with a neighbor. Now, I would never undermine that. That is the most important thing. But how many of us think of being the best employee we can be, the best student we can be? Understand, I'm not talking about the most honest or kind employee. I'm talking about producing high-quality work in your endeavor, high-quality work in whatever you do. God's original command to mankind is found in Genesis 1:28. It's often referred to as the cultural mandate. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. That means get married, have a family, organize and harness nature, be productive, build cities, install electricity, and even write software. Charles Spurgeon said in a sermon in 1874, "To a man who lives unto God, nothing is secular, everything is sacred. He puts on his workday garment, and it is a vestment to him. He sits down to his meal, and it is a sacrament. He goes forth to his labor, and therein exercises the office of priesthood. His breath is incense, and his life a sacrifice. He sleeps on the bosom of God, and lives and moves in the divine presence. To draw a hard and fast line and say, this is sacred, and this is secular, is to my mind diametrically opposed to the teaching of Christ and the spirit of the gospel." Amen. So that was 1874. So it tells you how long this issue has been going for. At least. It's been going much longer. Jordan Peterson says something kind of along the same lines, and he points out that we all take part in creation. We all make this world a little bit more like heaven or a little bit more like hell. It's all sacred. Now let's look at how the sacred-secular divide manifests itself in the political sphere. Well, I'll start on the personal/political first. Have you ever heard someone say something to the effect of, well, I don't believe that a person should fill in the blank, but I would never bind my beliefs on someone else? I've heard that many a times. And that always makes you cringe a bit for two reasons. One, if it's a big issue such as abortion, they've almost certainly been persuaded to put that issue into the subjective personal belief bucket. And two, it's a completely hypocritical statement. We all bind our morality on others, save for cowardice, and we might be too afraid to. If you saw a doctor stabbing a newborn baby, you do something about it. We just know it's wrong. But people have to be taught that that same action and atrocity is completely different whenever it happens perhaps a few minutes prior. Because we've been told that's a religious value. That's different. It's not suitable for the public sphere. During her confirmation hearings, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett said, "If you're asking whether or not I take my faith seriously, and I'm a faithful Catholic, I am. Although I would stress that my personal church affiliation or my religious belief would not bear in the discharge of my duties as judge." I mean, let that sink in. If our faith doesn't have any bearing on our judgments, on our careers, on our politics, who or what are we putting in charge? Those kind of comments give us a glimpse into just some of the consequences of the sacred-secular divided mind. Recently, Governor Asa Hutchinson, who apparently claims to be a Christian, recently vetoed a bill that was meant to protect children by restricting access to hormones, puberty blockers, and surgery based upon their assumed gender identity. His defense for the veto was that the bill was a cultural issue and did not belong in the realm of the government. Michael Knowles, he's a Catholic and conservative political commentator. He correctly pointed out that all political issues are cultural, and all cultural issues are ultimately religious. Everything is sacred. In response to the governor's veto, he rhetorically asked that if protecting children from gelding or sexual mutilation does not fall in the role of government, what does? Psalm 82, 2-4 says, "How long will you hand down unjust decisions by favoring the wicked? Give justice to the poor and the orphan. Uphold the rights of the oppressed and the destitute. Rescue the poor and helpless. Deliver them from the grasp of evil people." How can we as a society create laws that defend people from evil without being able to invoke and appeal to the ultimate authority on morality? What God says about justice, what God says is truth. And how did we get here? Like I said, this has been going on at least since the Enlightenment. But I'd like to talk a little bit about education. I mean, I wouldn't pin this all on education, but it has been integral to the propagation of this divided mindset. The first sentence in C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, is the following. I thought about doing an English accent, but I'm not going to do it. I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks. Now, he goes on to criticize a particular English textbook that taught more philosophy than literature, and not overtly, and perhaps not even intentionally. He didn't know. He notices how even the simple use of the word only can work to unravel the idea of objective virtue in a child's mind. He writes, "No schoolboy will be able to resist the suggestion brought to bear upon him by that word only. The very power of the authors depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. It's not a theory that they put into his mind, but an assumption which, 10 years hence, its origin forgotten and its presence unconscious, will condition him to take one side in a controversy which he has never recognized as controversy at all. The authors themselves, I suspect, hardly know what they are doing to the boy, and he, the boy, cannot know what is being done to him." The Oregon Department of Education recently endorsed and distributed a course, you may have heard this, called A Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction, Dismantling Racism in Mathematics Instruction. The material helps teachers examine their actions, beliefs, and values around teaching math. It claims white supremacy culture can show up in the classroom in various ways, including when the focus is on getting the right answer and when students are required to show their work. Now, as ridiculous as this is, they're right about one thing. Culture does show up in the classroom, and it can show up in the most subtle of ways. Consider that if a teacher who you've set up, or a parent has set up, as an authority figure for the child, just was to refer to Bruce Jenner as a she. As C.S. Lewis warned, don't underestimate the power of a simple word. Luke 6:40 reads, "The teacher is not above, or the student is not above the teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like their teacher." That doesn't necessarily imply good or bad, but Christians need to take it seriously. Other verses that come to mind: do not be deceived, bad company corrupts good morals. If you put them in a particular environment, they're going to absorb some of that environment. Now, as a side note, just about math, I've done no justice, nor could I, to how special math is. When I was first getting exposed to this notion of sacred-secular divide, I kept coming back to, well, not everything is religious. Mathematics is not religious. And I was thinking about it wrong. And again, unfortunately, there's not nearly enough time, and I'm not nearly capable enough to do it any justice, but I will just say that mathematics is the basis for all the hard sciences. And what's amazing is, even though it doesn't exist in the real material universe, it corresponds to it exactly. It's how God ordered the universe. One author said that it bridges the subjective and the objective. Perhaps some future lesson. Okay. Now that I've hopefully demonstrated the sacred-secular divide, that it's an epidemic, maybe even a pandemic, that's worse, I'd like to come back around to where we started, science. You've probably heard, the science says. Now, I wasn't sure who this guy was called the science, but I knew that he or she has been talking a lot lately. And I figured if the science is talking about something, it probably has to do with the sciences. So I started Googling. I wanted to know what the science is talking about. And let's see. Oh, all right. Well, I'll just read it. I Googled what the science says about physics. Now, I Googled this in exact phrase. 0 results. What the science says about quantum physics. 0 results. What the science says about chemistry. And also, I did all of these searches, what the science says about and what science says about, I tried multiple different ways. What the science says about chemistry, 0 results. What the science says about math, 0 results. What the science says about astronomy, meteorology, electricity, thermodynamics, 0. All 0. I go, what is going on? What has the science been talking about, if not these fields of science? So I started, and I just started to type in what the science says about and what the science say about, and Google will offer suggestions. Now, as you can see, it would say things like when life begins, religion, transgender athletes, dreams, when human life begins, astrology, COVID vaccine, opening schools, love, contraception, intermittent fasting, weighted blankets, the cause of current warming, the effectiveness of relaxation techniques, video games and ADHD, love, identifying high potential employees, dreams, self, astrology. Then I pressed enter and I got some results. And I did see quite a few results on COVID. And in all fairness, COVID does have to do with medicine and biology. There is science there. But reading through these articles, the science is a very, very, very small percentage. The vast majority of the words and effort have to do with what to do. They're making a moral argument. So it seems that science doesn't really it's not really interested, these science doesn't really seem to be all that interested in talking about hard science. The science likes to talk about social issues. William Briggs, the statistician that I've found quite insightful, recently wrote an article, How a Science Becomes the Science. And I'm going to read a fair amount from this article, and it's very insightful. Our main concern has become of science, now often by those who control it, the science. This is as mentioned, is the cult of science. Members are easy to spot. Not only do they use phrases like, we believe in science, or the science, and denier. And has there ever been a clear indication of religious intent than those words? But they all evince science, the false belief that knowing a scientific fact implies morally what should be done about that fact. That's also called the is-ought problem. Sidolaters, that's a nice play on words. Sidolaters, what we call the cult members, do not see the contradiction. To them, it is obvious, say, that because global cooling theory is true, I'm not sure why I said global cooling, but is true, it should and must be mitigated in this and only this way. Disputing the mitigation to them is equivalent to disputing the theory. And disputing the theory is verboten, because the theory is the science. One does not dispute dogma in any religion, lest one become a heretic and an apostate. A theory becomes the science when a mitigation or solution to the theory becomes more important than the theory itself. Not every theory becomes the science. For example, how chemical bonding occurs in metals is allowed, at least for now, to just be plain old science. This is plain old science because there's no call for mitigating chemical bonding. And by mitigating, I mean providing a solution to fix or manipulate an effect of the theory. This effect may be real or imaginary, but the mitigation is real. Tell one of these priests something like this. While I'm not convinced about climate change theory, since the models are so poor at making predictions, I believe we ought to follow all of the mitigation schemes. You will be praised as enlightened. Your denial will be forgiven and forgotten. It is irrelevant. The mitigation is the science, not the plain science. Try the conversation with Corona Doom, too. Say you disbelieve the theory, but support the mitigation and you will be praised. But say you believe all the models of exponential cases and deaths, but you don't think lockdowns and mask mandates should be implemented, and you will be loathed. Try it with any science that has become the science. Accept the theory, but reject the mitigation. You will very quickly learn the science has nothing to do with science and everything to do with solutions and mitigations. So why do the secularists feel the need to appeal to the science? Well, my belief is that since religious truths have been relegated to the realm of subjectivity and thus not suitable for the public sphere or binding on others, the science is used to legitimize and give authority to whatever in vogue moral issue they're designed to enforce upon others. Now, this is a bit of a crude slide, but it's something that I put together to try and illustrate. Hopefully it gets the message across. Now, as Christians, we should recognize that there are both objective natural truths and there are objective moral truths. They exist with God. They're independent of man. If mankind goes extinct, morality will still exist. Matter and energy will still exist, unless God decides to destroy it. But everyone, atheists included, agree that man is a flawed interpreter, incapable of assessing the objective. And we use tools. We use tools to remove as much subjectivity as possible for both moral and natural assertions. But we recognize that the total truth, the objective truth, is with God. The scientific method was created by a Christian for Christians. It was not meant to remove God. It was meant to remove man. It was meant to remove the interpreter and look at the objective truth. Now, I will just say that, well, we'll bring it up in the next slide, but the atheists or secularists don't even acknowledge that there are two. Well, we'll talk about it in the next slide. So they most often, and again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, they most often believe something along these lines. There is no God at the top. Matter, the natural universe, is at the top. There's an objective natural truth. They will say that. And you can only learn about it in one way, and that is general revelation. Now, that is contrasted to special revelation, which would be messages directly from God, prophecy. Those are special revelation. And Christians recognize those as a source of authority and information. Atheists and secularists do not. And so they believe that all information is studied through the natural world. But what they've done is they've moved, there is no objective moral truth here at the top with matter. They've moved it down below mankind into the subjective realm. So morality has been demoted. And it's unreliable. But no one would deny that morality exists, or very few people would anyway. And so, in order to advance the agenda, that's why you'll often see an atheist or a secularist appeal to the ad populum argument. That is, something is true because most people believe it so. Or they will appeal to science, or the science. Here's an article from Psychology Today. I just Googled, is there an objective morality? And it was the top hit, or something along those lines. And I'm going to read a little bit from what this guy has to say. Quote, "There is a need for clear, definite moral lines that cannot be crossed without universal, robust condemnation." And he gives some examples of the ones that are already existing. Racial and gender discrimination, sexual harassment, terrorism, ignoring global warming. These are often thought of as objectively, morally wrong. Now, he appeals to science to prove this. He says, every living animal with a nervous system can and does experience harm. It may be that every living thing experiences harm, but that is an issue for another time. I'm thinking he doesn't want to talk about plants. But he says harm is marked by fear, pain, hunger, thirst, sadness, frustration, any negative emotion or feeling. So far, so good. We're in agreement. I agree with his scientific observation that harm exists and is detected by the nervous system. Then comes the is-ought problem. I'm going to try to get through this without cracking up. All right, now the question is, why ought we check or mitigate such harm? The answer is, because it's harm. Harm is bad by definition. Morality requires us to avoid doing bad things. Again, by definition. Hence, we all have a moral duty not to harm other living things. The moral duty exists objectively because harm exists objectively. Just as 1 + 1 = 2 is objectively true, so we should not harm other living things is objectively true. This truth is simply based on the fact that harming exists and should be checked. I made it. So did you hear that? Morality, whatever that is, requires us to avoid doing bad things, whatever that is, and harm is bad. Sounds pretty scientific. Now the argument, of course, is totally nonsensical. And again, this was the first result from Google. But the fact that the author is striving to put morality into the objective category speaks volumes. Again, why is he making the case that morality is objective? So that his will can be binding on others. Far from being unbiased and objective, the author's sense of morality is coming first. It drives his reason. It drives his mind. It drives his science. So the author's viewpoint is not unique. I mean, that sounded ridiculous, but it's actually not unique. Maybe some people articulate it, I'm sure, much better. But it's pretty similar to some of the arguments made by new atheists such as Sam Harris. And although unbelievers have no logical justification for their values, they don't deny it exists. They live, oddly enough, more consistent than many Christians. They live as though everything is sacred. Morality drives everything we do. That's just the truth. It gives us our sense of worth. Dr. Abigail Shrier was recently interviewed by Jordan Peterson. She's a prominent doctor who's written on some of the social issues regarding all of the gender dysphoria and that movement. And she noted that many young doctors and therapists behind the movement are more dedicated to activism than their practice. And that can be observed across all society and all fields. I believe, and I didn't see Carrie in here, but I'm pretty sure that our own Carrie Smith, has a similar story, how she was taught in college that her career was a conduit for social reform, which is far greater value. It's the most important thing. Everything is sacred. Pontius Pilate famously, asked, maybe notoriously, asked, what is truth? And that's ironic because he was staring at it. Total truth, objective truth, is with God. Jesus said that he was the truth and the life. John 1:3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. I'll fit in one more little C.S. Lewis quote. He said, whenever he was discussing, some people kind of have a disdain for matter. And he said, God likes matter. He invented it. Colossians 1:17, Christ is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Colossians 2:3 says that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. We have a tendency to just say, oh, that's just talking about spiritual wisdom and spiritual knowledge. That's not what the verse says. We must understand that everything is sacred. Everything that we do has an impact on morality, or is driven by morality. It's related to morality. The Word of God pertains to every aspect of life. And not only that, God rules everything, including the natural world. Jesus proclaimed in Matthew 28:18 that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. He's the King of kings, above every ruler. He's not the king because we let him rule in some areas of our life, maybe whenever we're not in math class. He rules the government of the United States, whether we realize it or not. The question remains, what he'll do with us. Acts 28:27 says, "For the heart of this people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and return, and I would heal them." It's pretty interesting that he said, understand with their heart. I hope this lesson has been enlightening and edifying to everyone here. We need to be bold in our lives unto God. We need to show truth in everything we do, not just in some areas of our life, in every aspect in our life, in every endeavor. And of course, we're not perfect, but it's a change in mindset. What you do, even in your vocation, your career, is unto God or against God. Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven."